Today's final session, a month or so before the advent of Passover and Easter, and accordingly, we will closely examine whether there is any substance to the commonly held view that Jesus' Last Supper was a Passover meal. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, my name is Ellen Resnick, and I'm the Educational Programs and Outreach Manager at Classrooms Without Borders. Classrooms Without Borders is a premier provider of experiential professional development for teachers, educational leaders, and lifelong learners. We offer unique travel experiences and virtual learning opportunities enriched with academic literature, relevant content, and resources to enhance the learning experience. We do all of this through an authentic exploration into a complex narrative, engaging with scholars, fellow educators, experts, and contemporary witnesses, with the primary focus being the importance that historical place plays in our shared history. This is the foundation on which CWB was built over 11 years ago. We are so thankful for all your support over the years, and most especially these past 3 years of navigating our expanded presence for CWB, while also supporting our robust offerings. Over the past 3 years alone, we have offered over 440 virtual programs with over 75,000 participants, reaching almost 60 countries and most of the United States. If you'd like to make a donation to support our organization, I will drop the link in the chat for you in just a moment. I now have the pleasure of introducing today's scholar, who you all know very well, Paul Vergas. For the past decade, Paul was the principal of the secondary campus of Mount Scopius College, a large K-12 Jewish day school in Melbourne, Australia. He has also lectured in Bible and Jewish history at Monash University's Australian Centre for Jewish Civilization, and has taught about Jewish education as well as school leadership in the university's Faculty of Education. Since 2010, Paul has also curated and led Jewish study tours to various European destinations under the auspices of the Jewish Museum of Australia. For most of his professional life, Paul has been actively involved in Jewish-Christian dialogue, and he also works closely with teachers in the Catholic education sector. Please send any questions you have directly to me, Ellen Resnick, in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer all of them. With that, Paul, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Ellen, and good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to at least one participant. Eva, my friend, is sitting there and acknowledging her presence there. So as Ellen has mentioned to you, what we are going to be doing today in our final session, and it's quite appropriate that we do this in the lead up very shortly to Passover and Easter, is we are going to, let me just share my screen now. What we are going to do is we are going to deal with the question of Jesus's Last Supper. And in doing so, what I want to do is I want to frame my presentation basically around three organizing questions. The first one is, well, firstly, was it in fact a Passover meal? I know some of you may find that a rather strange question, because I think most of us have just come to assume that it probably was. The second related question is whether Jesus was crucified on or before Passover. And it's related to the first one, because if indeed his Last Supper was a Passover meal, the crucifixion would have taken place on Passover. But if it was not, it would have taken place before that. And the larger question I want to ask, and this is really of considerable significance both to Jews and Christians, is to ask the question, how did that Last Supper transition from what Jews today know to be, at least the Passover meal, know to be the celebration of the Exodus, and how within the Christian tradition did that transition to the institution of the sacrament of Holy Communion, or what many people refer to as the Eucharist? So those are the three questions that I'm going to be addressing. There's also one other question that I just want to pose, because some of you might be wondering, particularly if you're more familiar with the Jewish tradition, some of you might be wondering why I'm referring to it as a Passover meal and not the Passover Seder. People often say, well, Jesus celebrated a Passover Seder. And when we talk about a Seder, we are actually talking about a home-based celebration which consists of a number of highly organized steps. There are 14 steps, and that's why it's called a Seder, an order of service. So the question of why I'm actually using the term meal in the context of Jesus the Jew rather than a Seder will become clear as I share this next slide with you. So what I want to begin by doing, just to give you a little bit of background, is to sort of explain to you how we transition from the idea of a Passover meal to what is celebrated today as a Passover Seder. And we have this, this statement from the 12th chapter of the book of Exodus, when we actually have a description of the very first Passover being instituted. I'm not going to read the whole thing with you, but I just want to go through the statements that I've bolded. So the Lord says to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, he tells them to say to the congregation that on the 10th of this month, and the month that we are talking about in the Hebrew calendar is the month of Nisan, they should take a lamb for each family, a lamb for each household. Now, they should keep this lamb until the 14th day of the month, and then the whole assembled congregation of Israel shall slaughter it at twilight. And then, having slaughtered it, they will then, this is on the 14th day of Nisan, they will then eat the lamb that same night. They will eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs. Now, I basically have to stop there and say that that was the original Passover meal. It consisted essentially of three elements: the roasted lamb, the unleavened bread that we refer to, of course, as matzah, and bitter herbs that are referred to as maror. That's it. That was the full extent of the Passover meal. And I often, when I teach this material, and I'm with essentially only Jewish audiences, I say to them, wouldn't it be lovely to go back to the good old days instead of having to prepare for a month-long Passover meal at home and so on. But anyway, that was the original Passover meal. It was not an order of service. It was not a Seder, which brings us then to temple times. And from what we can discern in temple times, the Passover meal was actually done in two places. Firstly, there was the sacrifice of the Passover lamb, the Paschal lamb, if you want, in the temple, sometime in the late afternoon of the 14th day of the month. The lamb was actually sacrificed in the temple, but people also in their own homes individually sacrificed their own Paschal lamb. So it was happening in both places. It was happening in the temple, the sacrificial lamb for the whole community, if you want, and then in their individual homes. But still at this particular time, the Passover meal was not a Seder. It consisted essentially of these three elements, which brings us then finally to the post-destruction period. In other words, the temple was destroyed in the year of 70. And after the temple was destroyed in the year of 70, it was never rebuilt. There was never, well, at least in the Jewish imagination, it would only be rebuilt in Messianic times, but in historical time, that wasn't going to happen. And basically to replace the sacrificial lamb, the Paschal lamb, because without a temple, the lamb could not be sacrificed. What you have in its place is the evolution of a whole series of rituals that came to be known as the Seder, an order of service, these 14 steps. And even those 14 steps evolved over a period of time. So you can therefore understand why in the context of Jesus the Jew, I'm not talking about a Seder, because a Seder postdates the period of the temple when Jesus was alive. And it's much more appropriate to talk about a meal. So I guess we could say that if Jesus did celebrate a Passover meal, it would have consisted of these three elements that we see here: the Paschal lamb, the matzah, the unleavened bread, and the bitter herbs. And today, it's very, very different. Today, this is what a Passover Seder looks like. I thought it was just a bit cool with you to have Barack Obama in this particular one. By the way, there's a wonderful story about how the Seder started to be celebrated at the White House. The story is told that he was on the campaign trail about a year before he was elected, and they were in a hotel somewhere, and a number of his advisors who were Jewish were actually celebrating a Passover Seder in a hotel room. And he walks in, and he's familiar with this. He's obviously been to one of these things before. At the end of the Passover Seder, we say next year in Jerusalem. And he says, you're doing a Passover Seder. Well, let's hope it'll be next year in the White House. And indeed, when he got into the White House, that was the very first Passover Seder. But this is an order of service that you would not have seen in the time of Jesus. So let's get down to the nitty gritty. Let's get down to the question of whether, in fact, Jesus' Last Supper was a Passover meal. Well, let's firstly go to the Gospels. And there's a number of things that the Gospels agree upon. The first one is this. They all agree that Jesus died on what is referred to as the Day of Preparation. In other words, a Friday. In various places throughout the Gospels, there's a reference to a day of preparation, and Jesus, according to the Gospel material, dies on the day of preparation. Now, what is that? Well, there's a number of other places, but Mark is very clear on this. He says it was the day of preparation. In other words, he's referring to the day of Jesus' crucifixion. He says the day of preparation, that is the day before the Sabbath. And the Sabbath, of course, in Jewish tradition is a Saturday, and therefore this would have been on a Friday. That's how we know that the death of Jesus occurs on a Friday. And all Gospels basically agree on that in one way or another. They also agree on the fact that Jesus shared a final meal with his disciples the evening before his crucifixion. So that is something that they share in common. But the question that we have to pose is, was this necessarily a Passover meal? Now, before I even begin to tackle that question, just let me share with you a little bit of the Passover chronology in Second Temple times. I'm not going to tell you here the story of the Exodus, not chronology of the Exodus story, but the chronology of how the Passover was actually celebrated, the order of time and dates and whatever have you. So the first thing I should just ask you to keep in mind, and I think many of you will be familiar with this, possibly most of you, that when we talk about a Jewish day, unlike the regular calendar, when we sort of say a new day begins just after midnight and goes through till the next midnight, in the context of the Jewish calendar, a Jewish day begins at sunset and ends at sunset. So it's from one sunset to another. The significance of that will become clear as I go on. So in the context of the chronology of the celebration of Passover, we begin with the 14th day of the Hebrew month of Nisan. Now, on that day, during the daytime, in the temple, there would have been preparations for the Passover, all sorts, and that would have included the sacrifice of the Paschal lamb during the afternoon, during probably the late afternoon. That is on the 14th. Now, on the night of the 14th, and please remember that that would have been the start of the 15th, because sunset marks the beginning of a new day. On the night of the 14th, you would have had the Passover meal, including, of course, the sacrificed Paschal lamb, together with the bitter herbs and the matzah as well, the unleavened bread. And then on the 15th day, the actual next day, the full daylight, would have actually been the first day of Passover. So that's essentially what the chronology of the Jewish calendar looks like at around about the time of Passover. Today as well, but certainly that's the way it would have looked in Second Temple times because of the sacrifice of the lamb. Now, if the Last Supper was indeed a Passover meal, if it was, then using my time frame, remember I said Jesus, according to the Gospels, was executed on Friday. If that was indeed the case, and if his Last Supper was a meal, then Thursday, the 14th of Nisan, there would have been preparations for the meal. There would have been the sacrifice of the Paschal Lamb in the temple and also in people's individual homes, but very specifically and importantly in the temple. That night, which would have been, of course, the start of the 15th, would have been the Passover meal. In other words, it would have indeed been Jesus's Last Supper, followed by his arrest, and of course, his being taken to the home of the high priest, and so on and so on and so on. We talked about that briefly last time. And then we come to Friday, which is the first full day, if you want, of the 15th of Nisan, which, remember, I said to you is called the Day of Preparation. And it's the Day of Preparation not because it's Passover, but because you are preparing for the Sabbath, for Shabbat. But on this particular occasion, Passover coincided with Shabbat as well. It was a double whammy, if you want. It was doubly important. So it was the first day of Passover, and according to the narrative, at least that I've been telling, we have the crucifixion of Jesus. So that's exactly what the Last Supper, if it was a Last Supper, that's exactly what would have looked like. So the question that I want to ask now is, to what extent does this particular chronology stand up to scrutiny? So let's talk a little bit and begin with the link between the Last Supper and a Passover meal. And I want to begin here with the Synoptic Gospels. Remember, we talk about Synoptic Gospels, we're referring here to Mark, to Matthew, and to Luke. And they certainly refer, each one of them, to preparations that take place for a Passover meal on the day when the Paschal Lamb was being sacrificed. In one of the Gospels, Jesus actually tells his disciples to go and find a room where the Passover meal can be eaten and the Passover can be celebrated. So it's very, very clear in the Synoptic Gospels that preparations on the Thursday, the 14th of Nisan, for a Passover meal are underway. And then at the Last Supper itself, it's very clear that Jesus is involved in a Passover meal. So, for example, from Luke, we read that Jesus said to his disciples, "I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover," in other words, this Passover meal, "with you before I suffer." And of course, he is, in a certain sense, foretelling his crucifixion on the cross. But very, very clearly, he is acknowledging that what they are doing is eating a Passover meal. So that's very, very clear. But there's always a but. There's no straightforward things. Because when you get to the Gospel of John, John is not part of the Synoptic Gospels. He's a standalone gospel. He actually presents us with a different perspective. So he actually dates the crucifixion of Jesus to the day of preparation for Passover, right? In other words, according to him, the day that Jesus was crucified, people were actually preparing for the Passover, right? This is a very, very crucial difference. In the Synoptic Gospels, he's actually executed on the day of Passover itself because there's already been the Passover meal. But according to John, he's actually crucified as people are preparing for the Passover. And it's also, of course, a Friday, because that's the day in which the crucifixion takes place. So in other words, as I've said, just to summarize here, being a Friday, it was, in other words, a regular day of preparation for both the Sabbath and both the Passover. In other words, in John's chronology, the Passover meal would have actually been celebrated on that Friday evening, the beginning also of the Sabbath. So in other words, crucially, for John, Jesus would have died before the commencement of the Passover meal, whereas in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus has already had a Passover meal and actually is crucified on Passover itself. So a really, really very important point of distinction. So to summarize it, this is a little chart that more or less gives you the essential difference. You can basically see that in the synoptic chronology, the story really begins on Thursday when there are preparations for the Passover. The lamb is sacrificed that night, which is then, of course, the 15th of Nisan. You have the Last Supper, a Passover meal. Then on the 15th of Nisan, which is a Friday, according to the synoptic chronology, you have the first day of Passover, the crucifixion, but it's also a day of preparation because it's Friday. You're preparing for the Sabbath. Saturday is just a regular Shabbat. And then on Sunday is the day of the resurrection, right? So 3 days after the crucifixion. Now, on the other hand, when you look at John, you have a rather different picture, because John's story begins actually the night before. It doesn't begin on the 14th of Nisan, because the 14th of Nisan is actually a Passover meal. John does refer to a meal, but actually, quite interestingly, he refers to a meal just in passing. He says after supper, and you imply from that there must have been a meal at that time, but he just simply says after supper, Jesus said this and this and this. So according to him, it was just a normal meal. And then on Friday, which is Passover Eve, it is a day of preparation according to John, as it is for the synoptics, for the Sabbath. But it's also the day on which the Paschal lamb is sacrificed. But crucially, according to John, Jesus is crucified also on the 14th, but in his calendar chronology, the 14th is the crucifixion is on the 14th of Nisan. In other words, the Passover has not yet begun. And then it's the first day of Passover on the 15th of Nisan, and then the Sunday and the resurrection. So Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, they all sort of, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, they all agree, but they have a different dating. John is 1 day out from the other synoptic gospels. Now, you might think, well, big deal, it's only a day, but that day, as we're going to see, is of crucial importance. So, the question that that I therefore want to pose is, should we actually follow the dating of the synoptics? Now, if we follow their dating, and if, in other words, in particular, if we say that Jesus was actually crucified on Passover Day, because the meal, the Passover meal had been done before, there are a number of problems that we run into. Firstly, it's very problematic, according to Jewish law, that a Jewish trial would have actually taken place at night and during a festival. Because you remember in the story, Jesus is arrested by the high priest's guards, if you want. He's taken to the home of the high priest, and there's a sort of like a kangaroo court that evening before he's handed over to Pilate the next day. It is a trial of sorts. It's not a kosher trial. It's not one that, according to Jewish law, can happen, but it's highly unlikely that the high priest would have actually conducted the trial at night, probably even interrupting the Passover meal and so on. So that's one thing. That's the point that I made here. The interruption by the Jewish authorities of the Passover meal to arrest Jesus and to preside over his trial is highly unlikely. And then you also have the situation where, according to the synoptic story, Jesus is actually handed over to Pilate the next day on Friday morning. And according to the story, the priests and the people and so on actually attend the trial. And again, it's highly unlikely that the religious leaders would have abandoned their sacrificial duties on the first day of Passover to attend Pilate's hearing. I mean, we know that the sacrifice was conducted in the afternoon, but still you had to make preparations for it and so on and so on. It's highly unlikely that this would have been the case. And the other problem is this, that a trial that actually involved a death penalty could not actually be held according to Jewish law on the eve of the Sabbath or on a festival. So if indeed the story is to be taken at face value, that the high priest and his colleagues, if you want, condemned Jesus to death and handed him over to Pilate and so on. The problem with that is that you can't actually invoke a death penalty on the eve of the Sabbath, which it would have been, or a festival, because you remember all this is happening on Friday. Now, when you follow John, what happens is that you actually avoid all of these problems, because with John, remember, his date for Jesus' crucifixion is the 14th of Nisan, which is the eve of Passover, and the day of Passover preparations. So there's no trial taking place. There's nothing of that sort. And therefore, there is no problem with a trial being held the night before, which according to John was the 13th of Nisan. In other words, the Passover has not yet begun, just a regular night. So there was nothing to actually worry about. And the possibility of the chief priests appearing before Pilate early on Friday morning can also be entertained. It's the eve of Passover. It's not the holiday itself. And yes, they are preparing, but early in the morning, they could have been there and attended the trial. This is not beyond possibility. However, from a Christian point of view, the problem with John's dating is very, very significant, because crucially, in the synoptic version, the Passover meal coincides with the initiation of the Holy Communion. That is when, according to the Synoptic Gospel, you have the beginning of the first Eucharist. Jesus stands up and says, this is my, holds up the bread, this is my body, this is my blood, when he holds up the cup. And in time to come, when you eat this bread and drink this wine, it will be in remembrance of me and of my suffering. So John has no reference to this at all. John has no Passover meal. He has no meal which talks about the initiation of the Eucharistic meal sometime to come in Christianity. So from a Christian point of view, this is somewhat, at least in terms of reading John, the absence of the initiation of the Eucharist as a sacrament could be regarded as problematic. However, I would still argue that on balance, John's dating of Jesus's crucifixion makes more sense, because when you look at all of the problems that the synoptic dating presents to us, you would have to conclude that the high priest and his colleagues, the Sadducees they would have broken Jewish law. And that's really, really highly, highly unlikely. So I think on balance, John's dating makes a lot more sense. In other words, according to John, there was a last meal, but it wasn't a Passover meal. And Jesus is actually crucified on the Passover, on the eve of Passover, as the sacrifice is being conducted. So here's my question, and this is an important one. If the Last Supper was an actual historical event, one might wonder why it was that these early Christian writers couldn't agree on the simple fact of whether it actually occurred on the opening night of Passover or on the day of Passover, or even at all. And how can we account for the variation between the synoptics and between John? And this is where I want to spend a little bit of time exploring this question. And it basically comes down to the theological focus of the individual gospel writers. So when you look at the synoptic writers, the writers of the synoptic gospels, their theological focus, as we're going to see in a few minutes, is a very, very different one to the theological focus of John. And once you understand that, you can understand why John does what he does. In other words, why John does not have Jesus celebrating a Passover meal, and why he has him being executed on the eve of Passover, when the sacrificial lamb is actually being sacrificed in the temple itself. So crucially for the synoptics, Jesus's Last Supper is actually timed to coincide with his explaining to his disciples the meaning of the bread and the wine in the context of a Passover meal. And I emphasize this. For the synoptic gospels, when Jesus has that meal and eats the bread and the wine, it's important for them that it's not just an ordinary meal. It's important for them that it was actually taking place in the context of a Passover meal. And we read in Matthew, and you have a very similar one in Mark as well, where Jesus, where we have this description. Now, as they were eating, Jesus took bread and blessed and broke it, as any Jew would have done, and gave it to the disciples and said to them, "Take, eat. This is my body." And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, my blood of the covenant. The term covenant is very important in this particular context. So, in other words, it's very, very clear that for the synoptics, the link between the Passover meal and the institution of the Eucharist or Holy Communion clearly was a central concern for them. There's absolutely no question of this. And the point that I make here, this link between the Passover meal and the origin of the Eucharist, the Holy Communion, it comes through very, very clearly in the homepage of this. So what we, in other words, have, before I go there, in other words, let's be very clear, in the description of the Passover meal, the Last Supper of Jesus, we are actually moving from Exodus to Eucharist. That's essentially what's happening. You remember, this is one of the questions that I posed to you at the beginning. So in this homepage from a church in southern Wales, the parish of Syllabebish, we read the following: the Eucharistic sacrament of the Christian church originated 2,000 years ago at a celebration of the most important and the most ancient of the Jewish festivals. It originated, we read here, in the guest room of a house in Jerusalem, where a Jewish rabbi and his Jewish disciples had assembled to celebrate the Passover. Now, during this ritual, the rabbi, Jesus, took the two elements of the Passover meal, namely bread and wine, and offered them to his disciples. And I emphasize here myself with new words of explanation, thus giving these elements a new significance. Now, his purpose in doing this and the meaning of his words can only be fully understood in their Jewish setting and against the background of the Passover that Jesus celebrated with his disciples in the last hours before his arrest and crucifixion. Now, later Christian interpretations and developments, if they are true to the intention and meaning of Jesus, must go back to that Passover celebrated in the upper room in Jerusalem. In other words, they conclude that in order to understand the meaning of the Eucharist, we must in the first instance look at the Jewish Passover. When we do, we can see, and again, I emphasize this, how key elements of the Jewish festival has passed into the Christian sacrament. In other words, we have moved from the celebration of the Exodus to the initiation of the Eucharist, from Exodus to Eucharist. And I think the statement brings all of those elements together very, very nicely and very, very, very clearly. Now, if the truth be told, an argument, despite the fact that I said to you that I think John's dating is to be preferred, and to sort of argue that they're probably the Passover meal of the Last Supper of Jesus was not a Passover meal. Nevertheless, we should not ignore the fact that there are a number of symbolic and theological links between the Passover and the Eucharist. And for Christians, I think understanding these links is particularly important. You see, when we think about the Passover being celebrated in a Jewish context, what we are really doing is celebrating a memorial, a remembrance of deliverance from Egypt. And we actually read in the book of Exodus that when you celebrate this particular meal, it will be for you a day of remembrance. You will celebrate it as a festival to the Lord. Throughout your generations, you shall observe it as a perpetual ordinance in remembrance of the Exodus. That's what becomes very, very clear. But what actually happens is that when you go to the gospel narrative, we are moving from a remembrance of Exodus to the remembrance of Jesus' death and resurrection. As Luke says, he took a loaf of bread. When he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to him, said, "This is my body, which is given for you. And note, do this, eat the bread and the wine in remembrance of me." There's no reference here in remembrance of the Exodus. And he did the same with the cup after supper, saying, "This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." So you can start to see a very, very important point of transition. And Paul makes an even stronger link, if you want, and not only between the Passover meal, but the whole of the Passover elements, the unleavened bread, the Paschal lamb. he connects those very, very strongly to the death of Jesus and his resurrection, when metaphorically, he says, clear out the old yeast. Because clearing out the old yeast, of course, is a reference to cleaning out the leavening of Passover, the material in the house before Passover. So clear out the old yeast so that you may become a fresh batch of dough, inasmuch as you are unleavened. You are like pure. For our Paschal lamb, that is Christ, has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us celebrate the feast, not with the old yeast, but with that is the yeast of malice and the yeast of wickedness, that with the unleavened bread, the pristine bread, if you want, of sincerity and truth. So clearly, Paul has a whole polemic here against certainly on the face of it, he has a certain polemic against Jewish practice. But Paul is, in fact, a lot more complicated than that. But I don't have time, of course, to deal with that particular issue. So here is where I bring you to the scholarly material. Moving away from the actual synoptic gospels, one of the interesting questions that scholars debate is whether Jesus actually himself established the Eucharistic ritual at that meal, or whether the words that we have just read from Luke were actually attributed to him by the early church once the sacrament was established. In other words, let's be very, very clear here. In the scholarly view, there are indeed scholars who have no issue with the synoptic version. They say, yes, in our view, Jesus stood up that night and held up the bread and wine and uttered these particular words. In other words, he initiated the sacrament of the Eucharist. On the other hand, there are scholars who sort of say that that is not the case, that yes, there was a Last Supper. Yes, it was a Passover meal. Yes, Jesus was crucified. And sometime after his crucifixion, the nascent, very early community of Jesus' followers basically ritualized that particular night and connected it to his death and to his resurrection. In other words, it was a ritual that was established not long after that Last Supper. And if you want to put it another way, they put these words into the mouth of Jesus. This is what they created, a particular Jesus in this way. And basically, Stephen Weiland, the Jews in the time of Jesus, says, we have to remember that this is not a debate that is about history. It's a debate that is grounded in theology. Because he says those Christians who believe that Jesus established an actual church, in other words, not just a teaching, but an actual organization to actually promote that teaching, are prone to believe that Jesus initiated the sacraments of the church. And not only Holy Communion, but the sacrament, for example, of baptism, right? They all believe that these originated with Jesus. Now, those Christians who believe that Jesus rejected all hierarchies, all institutions, and rituals of organized religion, believe that Jesus would never have established a formal ritual of the type that we are talking about. And I think Weiland quite correctly makes the point that it is not possible to convincingly prove either side of this debate, because it's really a debate not about history, but about the proper constitution of the Christian church of today. And that's an important point that I made at the beginning of this series of lectures. And it's something I'm going to reiterate at the very end, that when we talk about these matters and we get involved in these historical discussions, we often have to remember that if we are looking at this material from a historical point of view, we have to separate faith from history. And often the two are not necessarily in agreement necessarily with each other. But anyway, that is a debate that you should be aware of. I'm certainly not about to put my head on the chopping block and take one side or another, but I think it's important that people are aware that among scholars, at least, this is a debated question. Now, let me share with you a statement regarding this question by James Tabor. Now, I have to tell you straight away that James Tabor comes from the radical end of Christian theology. He is the nightmare of many conservatives within the Christian fold, not only just believers, but even scholars. And he actually makes what I think is quite a compelling case in the following form. And he says, the most central of all Christian rites, that is the Eucharist or Holy Communion, actually involves eating the flesh and drinking the blood of Christ. Now, whether you understand that symbolically or literally doesn't matter, but this practice is at once as familiar as it is strange. Millions participate in some form, whether they believe literally or symbolically, of this ritual regularly. But where did it originate, and how can we know? Now, he quotes Paul, and he says, "For I have received from the Lord what I have handed on to you." And remember that Paul is writing a small number of years after the death of Jesus. He has established a small community of believers. He says, "I'm handing on to you what I received from the Lord, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' And he says, in the same way, he took the cup after supper and said, 'This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me.'" Now, Tabor asks this question: where would Paul have gotten such a detailed description of what Jesus had said on the night that he was betrayed? Now, the common assumption has been that this core tradition, so central to the original Jesus movement, had actually circulated orally for decades in the various Christian communities. And that would be true. We know that there were all sorts of traditions about Jesus that were circulating after his death by word of mouth. Now, Paul could have received it directly from Peter or James, of course, who were the disciples of Jesus, on his first visit to Jerusalem around the year of 40, or he might have even learned it from a Christian congregation in Antioch, which is in Syria, where, according to the book of Acts, he first established himself as an apostle of Christ. Now, one way of sharpening this distinction is to ask, says Tabor, is it historically probable that Jesus uttered the words about the bread being his body and the cup of wine his blood? And now he goes on after this to develop a very, very lengthy argument. And that's why I've given you the link to the website, because if you want to sort of get an understanding of how Tabor comes to this conclusion that I'm about to share with you, you have to really go back to that article. But the conclusion he comes to, given this background, given everything that I have said, blah, blah, I think we can conclude that it is inconceivable that Jesus would have had his followers drink a cup of wine, even symbolically, as a representation of his blood, or break bread to represent his body sacrificed for his sins. And one of Tabor's main arguments is that blood was anathema to Jews, and it still is, right? Blood is something that cannot be consumed. You have to go to great lengths to remove blood from meat before it's actually consumed. And given, Tabor argues, that Jesus was an observant Jew following Jewish law, and blood is actually forbidden in the Torah itself, he argues, therefore, I think somewhat plausibly, that it's highly unlikely that Jesus would have made this particular statement, and that it might have come sometime after his particular death. But anyway, that's something I leave you to ponder and to follow up with that reading if you are interested. Now, let us turn now to John, because so far we have been dealing with the theological focus of the Synoptic Gospels. And I want to now talk about John's theological focus. And remember that crucially, for John, if there is a Last Supper, but it's not a Passover meal, but most importantly, whereas the Synoptic Gospels have Jesus being crucified once the Passover has already begun, John has Jesus being crucified on the day of preparation for the Passover, when the sacrifice sacrificial lamb is being sacrificed in the temple, and so on and so on. So what's important to understand is that when you read John's account of the crucifixion, Jesus is actually sacrificed very dramatically in John at the very moment, the same moment that the Paschal lambs were actually being sacrificed in the temple. You can almost imagine a movie director, as he is sort of filming the scene on the crucifixion of Jesus, moving straight away to the temple, almost even a split screen, and you actually see the lamb in the temple being sacrificed as Jesus is being crucified as well. In other words, what is important to understand here is that what John is doing is accentuating the parallel between the sacrifice of the Paschal lambs in the temple and the sacrificial death of Jesus. The coincidence of these two things is very, very important for John. Now, you have to understand that one of the central themes in John's gospel is the theme of Jesus as the Lamb of God. In fact, in the very, very opening chapter of John, as John, not John, the author of the gospel, but John the Baptist, is speaking to a crowd of people, and he sees Jesus approaching down the road, and he says, look, here is the Lamb of God, Agnus Dei, as it's referred to in Latin, who actually takes away the sin of the world. So from the very, very beginning, this motif of Jesus as Lamb of God is therefore very, very important. And then this concept is emphasized by Paul in 1 Corinthians, where he says, Christ, our Paschal Lamb, has been sacrificed for us. So the coincidence, the matching of the lamb in the temple, the sacrificial lamb, and Jesus as the sacrificial Lamb of God is therefore brought together. So in a certain sense, one could say that both for Paul and for John, the Paschal Lamb of Exodus as a sort of a type becomes fulfilled in the person of Jesus, right? So whereas the Paschal Lamb in the book of Exodus is connected to the story of the Exodus, what happens in John is that the Paschal Lamb of Exodus 12 becomes actually fulfilled in the person of Jesus, because Jesus himself becomes the Lamb of God. So in other words, by locating Jesus's crucifixion, at the very moment of the temple sacrifice, what Jesus is doing is depicting Jesus as the true Paschal Lamb whose sacrifice atones for the sins of the world. That is a very, very central theme in John's Gospel. Now, I want to stop here for a moment before I move on to the next slide and make an important observation. You see, in not only in the scholarly world, but even amongst believing and practicing Christians, there is an interesting debate and a discussion as to whether the Gospel of John is a non-sacramental gospel. I'm not saying anti, but a non-sacramental gospel. I mean, to give you an example, John has absolutely no reference at all to the initiation of the Eucharistic meal, right? So that very central sacrament of Christianity is not present in John's Gospel. And whereas the Synoptic Gospels make a point of referring to the baptism of Jesus, another important sacrament, that is not present in the Gospel of John, which leads a number of people to sort of say, well, can we conclude therefore that John is a non-sacramental gospel? Now, I'm going to leave that question for Christians to sort out for themselves. I'm not about to enter in that debate. But nevertheless, I think it is important to make the point. It's not as though the Eucharist itself does not appear in John. We're simply talking about the question of the Eucharistic meal and its initiation. So, for example, in the slide that I'm about to share with you, this is one of the places where John actually does emphasize the Eucharistic, the symbolism of the Eucharist. He doesn't talk about its origin. And one of the very strong themes in John is the theme of I am the bread of life. In John, there are a number of very important I am statements. And so he says, I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven so that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven, just like the manna did. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. So I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Now those who eat my flesh and drink my blood have eternal life, and I will raise them up on the last day. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them. And just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so whoever eats with me will live because of me. And he says, this is the bread that came down from heaven, not like that which your ancestors ate and they died, but the one who eats this bread will actually live forever. He said these things while he was teaching in the synagogue at Capernaum. So I think what's very, very important to emphasize is that it's not as though the Eucharist is not important for John. I mean, as you can see here, it's central. I mean, this is a statement that makes very, very clear why the Holy Communion, the Eucharist for John is such a central part of being a Christian. And by the way, you can see that if James Tabor had problem with the initiation of a Eucharist at the meal, as in the Synoptic Gospels, this statement of John would be even more problematic, because Tabor, who sort of makes the point that Jews would never have entertained the idea of blood, he would see in this statement a direct contravention of anything that one sees in the Jewish legal tradition. So it is, in other words, the Eucharistic symbol is important, but for John, the initiation of the ceremony is not present. But nevertheless, so whether John is a non-Eucharistic gospel or not, he's non-Eucharistic in the sense that he's non-sacramental, in other words, in the sense that he doesn't actually describe the origin of the sacrament, but certainly he puts a lot of emphasis on it as a sacrament. Now, I want to veer away now. I think now I've actually answered my three questions. And there's no clear answer, because the short answer to those three questions, well, the first two, is it depends on whether you follow John or it depends on whether you follow the Synoptic Gospels. So if you follow one, it was a Passover meal. If you follow the other, it wasn't. If you follow one, he was sacrificed on Passover. If you follow the other, he was sacrificed before. But I hope I've been able to answer satisfactorily how the transition occurred from a remembrance of Exodus to a remembrance of Jesus's death and resurrection, and so on. So as we get to the end of my presentation, I want to talk a little bit about the narrative of Jesus's passion. Now, when we talk about the passion of Jesus, very, very narrowly, we're actually talking about Jesus on the cross, the suffering of Jesus on the cross. More broadly, it refers to all of the events leading up to his final crucifixion. But for the purposes of our current discussion, I want to sort of define here the passion of Jesus as Jesus on the cross itself. And when we look at, for example, Mark 15, we read the following. They brought Jesus to a place called Golgotha, and that is where they crucified him, and they divided his clothes amongst them, casting lots to decide what each should take. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. Now those who passed by, as they saw him on the cross, derided him. And in much the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him amongst themselves, and they were saying, he saved others, but he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, they said, sarcastically, come down from the cross now so that we may see and believe. And by the way, the reason why the presence of the chief priest at this moment is very, very problematic is the chief priest is actually meant to be conducting the Passover sacrifice, at least, the chief priest, it's the day of Passover itself, and there's all sorts of problems. Now, we go on and read that when it was noon, darkness came over the whole earth until 3 p.m. And at 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, and all of the Gospels don't translate this. This is Aramaic. And he says, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, Mark translates, my God, why have you forsaken me? And by the way, Elohi, Elohi, lama sabachthani has a source, which we'll see in a minute. And someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to Jesus to drink, to ease his suffering, in other words. Then Jesus gave a loud cry, and he breathed his last. Now, what's really, really very interesting, if you know your Hebrew scriptures, as you are reading this description of Jesus's passion, you would be saying to you, wait a minute, I have heard this somewhere before. There's an echo here of something I have read somewhere before. So, for example, if you go to the book of Amos, one of the prophets in the Hebrew Bible, he says this, "Hear this, you that trample on the needy and bring to ruin the poor of the land on that day." And he's referring to that day of judgment. "On that day of judgment, says the Lord, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. And I will turn your feasts into mourning and your songs into, and all your songs into lamentation." And then if you go to the book of Psalms, the suffering servant of the psalmist, the writer of Psalms has a figure who he refers to as the suffering servant of God, the servant of God. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Precisely in the Hebrew language that we've read. "Why are you so far from helping me from the words of my groaning? Look," he says, "all who see me, they mock me. They make mouths at me, they shake their heads. They say, commit your cause to the Lord. Let him deliver you. Let him rescue the one in whom he delights. Because dogs are all around me." In other words, a company of evildoers encircle me. They stare and they gloat over me. And look what they do. They divide their clothes amongst themselves, and for my clothing, they actually cast lots. Now, I think what's actually remarkable is that when you read this statement from Mark, and similarly in the other synoptic gospels, you can clearly, very clearly start to see parallels between the description of the synoptic writers of Jesus's passion and the direct parallels between these statements in the Hebrew scriptures itself. So the question you have to ask is, what's going on here? And the answer to that question is going to depend very, very much on whether you go down the conservative scholarly route within the Christian world or the very radical route. And again, this is a question that is debated amongst scholars of the New Testament. And so what you have is, for example, two quite distinct approaches. There's the approach of Raymond Brown, who wrote a very important book, amongst others, called Death of the Messiah. And I would locate him at the very conservative end of the scholarly discussion within Christianity. And then you have Dominic Crossan, wrote something called Who Killed Jesus? And he is at the very radical end. Crossan is associated, by the way, with a movement called the Jesus Seminar. The Jesus Seminar actually began a number of decades ago, and they are basically a collection of quite radical, very, very at the strong liberal left end, if you want, of Christian theology. Dominic Crossan himself was once a Catholic priest, but he left the priesthood and so on. Now, I think what's important to understand that when we look at Crossan and Brown, they agree on one thing. They both recognize the essentially theological character of the Gospels and their late first century origins. So they actually agree that the Gospel material was written after the death of Jesus, but very, very importantly, they differ on the question of how to actually read and to appraise the Passion narrative itself. So if we start with Raymond Brown, he actually argues that there were eyewitnesses and ear witnesses who were in a position to know the broad lines of Jesus's passion. In other words, he would argue that even though the gospel material was written after the death of Jesus, there were people who were actually there and saw all of that and passed that down by word of mouth. And the gospel writers got that tradition. And so he argues that from the earliest days, available raw material could have been developed into a passion narrative extending from the arrest to the burial itself. So in other words, his argument is that the passion narratives are characterized by what he calls very similitude. In other words, it's not exactly word for word, but it's very, very similar, very similitude, right? And so there's a core of absolute truth to what's going on. Now, when you come to Dominic Crossan, he sort of argues quite oppositely that there really is no detailed historical information about Jesus's crucifixion in the passion narrative. Now, don't get me wrong. Crossan is not arguing absolutely not arguing that there was no crucifixion. He's not arguing that there was no Jesus. But he's arguing that whatever we read in the gospel material, what we're in the Passion narrative, that's essentially not historically based. In other words, he argues that the narrative of the Passion of Jesus sheds light on the historical circumstances of those who composed that narrative and not of the characters themselves. In other words, he's basically arguing that the writers had a certain, to use a modern day term, a certain agenda, and they wish to present Jesus's passion in a particular way. And so he therefore argues, going back to my references to the Hebrew scriptures a few minutes ago, he actually argues that what the writers of the Gospels were doing is that through their narratives, they were actually presenting a post-crucifixion interpretation of Old Testament prophecy. In other words, he makes this point, to quote from him, the Passion narratives are not history remembered, but prophecy historicized. In other words, the argument that Crossan develops is an interesting one, because he says when Jesus dies on the cross, what his disciples and his followers need to do, you see, that they're in shock. They're in total and absolute shock, because Jesus, of course, was the predicted Messiah. He was meant to bring about the end of Roman rule and bring about a messianic age and so on and so on. But that didn't happen, of course. In fact, at the time of Jesus, the situation for Jews became worse and worse and worse. So Jesus died before this final messianic age was. So his followers were in absolute shock. And what Crossan argues is that they looked for meaning in Jesus's death, in his crucifixion. And if you are a Jew at that time, and all of Jesus' disciples were Jews, and they knew their Hebrew Bible back to front, where do you go to find meaning in tragedy? You go back to the Bible itself. And he argues, therefore, that when they go back to Amos, when they go back to Psalms, they have a sort of a template, if you want, by which they come to describe the final moments of Jesus on the cross. And they use that as a sort of a template. In other words, to give theological weight, if you want. It's not just an ordinary death for them, because you've got to remember, everyone was being crucified in Roman times. So what makes this crucifixion special? It is actually a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. It is prophecy historicized. So where I want to finish off, and we are going to have time for questions, not only on what I've spoken about today, but on other issues that I've raised today, this is where I want to finish off. I want to finish off with a statement about the historicity of the gospel material. When we talk about historicity, it's a combination of accuracy and history, historical accuracy. So the first point that I have to emphasize is that, and certainly scholars would agree with this, and certainly many Christians, but not all. I acknowledge that there are people of faith within the Christian world who would not necessarily agree with this, but nevertheless, I take the position that the Gospels are not history in the modern sense of the word. And I would say the same, by the way, about the Hebrew scriptures as well, the Old Testament. In other words, what I'm suggesting here is that the evangelists did not have historical reporting as their primary goal. They weren't interested in simply telling us, the audience, what once happened. That wasn't their primary goal. Rather, they used stories, traditions, and memories of Jesus to awaken faith within their recently founded Christian communities. You've got to understand, as I make the point again, these were communities that were in a state of shock. There was a big danger that whatever faith had been developed during the time of Jesus' own lifetime, there was a real danger that that faith would have dissipated after his death, because the messianic vision had come to fulfillment. So there was an important requirement, important need to awaken faith in their Christian communities. So the authors of the gospel as preachers really were the ones who then imposed on their material a theological message. So we need to ask, how did their theology contribute to the shaping of the historical narrative about the life and the death of Jesus? In other words, what I'm making very clear here is that the position that I take, as I take, by the way, with the Hebrew scriptures themselves, is that you have faith and history being intertwined with each other. And the task of the scholar who tries to uncover the Jewish Jesus, remember this course is about the historical Jewish Jesus. The task of the scholar is to try and separate out the strands of history and the strands of theology, and to try and keep them quite separate. And so, to conclude here from Stephen Weiland, he says historical scholars have debated which version of the Passion narrative is more historically accurate, that of the Synoptics or that of John, taking us back to our earlier question. And it's generally agreed, he says, that the Synoptic Gospels are more biographical, but in this case, there is no way to argue over historical events. What lies behind the different versions of the story, that is the story of Jesus's passion, the Last Supper, and so on, is not two different remembrances of the events of Jesus' arrest and trial. What we have here are two different versions of the meaning of Passover symbols for Christian faith. In the Synoptics, the matzah and the wine of the Seder are the important symbols, while to John, the Paschal lamb is the important symbol. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides. And before I open up for questions, Ellen, I want to, because I'm certain that if I don't mention it now, I'm going to forget it. I want to share with people here a number of books that are worth looking at if they want to pursue the discussion further. The first one that I hold up here is From Jesus to Christianity. From Jesus to Christianity, the author is L. Michael White. This is an outstanding book. I mean, if there is one book, you say to me, what's the one book that you think I should go out and get? This is the one, because it not only covers the material that I've been covering, but it actually goes beyond the Gospels themselves. It covers the very earliest Christian communities, and the title is important. It tells us how the whole story moves from Jesus, the Jew, to Jesus, the Christian, if you want, right? And it's brilliant. It's written for a popular audience, but this is what's great about it. If you Google From Jesus to Christianity, the PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service in the United States, actually put out a documentary. I think it was a one-part or three-part Public Broadcasting Service. So this is a companion volume that goes with the TV series. And the TV series has got some fantastic graphics and huge numbers of articles that you can hyperlink and all sorts of things. So the combination of this with the Public Broadcasting Service one is probably an outstanding source. The other one that I would recommend, and I know you might think I'm joking, but I'm not, it's the Historical Jesus for Dummies. Now, I'm not insulting your intelligence, but it is outstanding. And when I once taught at university level, and I was teaching about this material, often I found that there was material here because my students had no theological background. And often this was outstanding, particularly combined, these two together basically were very, very good. If you want to dig a little bit deeper, but a quite accessible one, Jesus, a Short Biography by Martin Forward. And it is quite short. It's quite a small volume, but he certainly deals with many of the issues that I raised. And finally, not so much a book about the story of Jesus's life, but a very, very important book for both Jews and Christians, Amy Jill Levine's The Misunderstood Jew. Crucial reading, because what this helps you do is when you read a book like this, it helps both Jews and Christians avoid the pitfalls of reading the Gospels and the New Testament at face value. Because when you read the New Testament at face value, Jews can often fall into the trap of saying it's all anti-Semitism. And of course, when Christians read the New Testament at face value, they end up with things like Pharisees are hypocrites and Jews are the devil's brood. And what Amy Jill Levine does is sort of shows you how to avoid those crucial traps. So all those 4 books are worthwhile. So Ellen, I'm going to hand over to you. We actually have quite a lot of time today for questions.
Fantastic. And I did journal all of those topics of those books, and I'll be sure to include that in our follow-up email. Quite a few people were asking for past events. So also in our follow-up email, I will be sure to include the entire playlist. So we have all of those pieces for you as well. All right, so here we go with our questions. Early on in your discussion, Amalia said, did the Sherahidan, meet the afternoon of the Passover meal to make judgments?
Well, again, it's not the case, because it was the preparation of it. So you got to remember that on the eve of the Passover, the sacrifice is being readied and prepared in the temple. It's not an occasion that the Sanhedrin would have met. And let's say theoretically, even if they would have met, it's not an occasion when they would have passed the sentence of death and so on, because by law that couldn't have happened. So yeah, that's again another point that we have to remember. Absolutely.
Fantastic. And this kind of piggybacks on the books that you just recommended. So again, early on in your lecture, Stephen commented that you referred to the author Amy Jill Levine as a scholar of New Testament. He has also read Kosher Jesus by Rabbi Shmuley Boteach. And could you comment regarding each author, please? Okay.
Now, Shmuley Boteach, as is his name.
Thank you.
Shmuley Boteach. Now, look, Shmuley Boteach is essentially he's a polemicist, and I would not regard him as a serious academic scholar. He's provocative. He writes books to be provocative. He's a very out there, in your face sort of character. So it's not a book that I would be running to, at least from a personal point of view, to get. If you really want to be a lot more grounded in the sort of historical and theological stuff that I've been talking about, I would, if you're saying to me, where should I spend my money? I think you can do better than Boteach's book. But my worry is, of course, is that this will get out, and the next thing I'm going to end up with some defamation case. But I'm not defaming him. I'm simply saying that I think that there are better books than his on this particular subject. I think that's pretty safe ground.
I think so. I agree. And then there are two questions. When is John written, and when are the synoptics written? Okay, so the earliest of the synoptic gospels, even though the New Testament begins with Matthew, and you think that that's the earliest gospel, it's not. The earliest gospel is Mark, and Mark would have been written around about the year of 70. Matthew around about the year of 80, 85. Luke about 90. John about 100, 110. Now that's very simple. There's considerable debates amongst, but certainly the academic view is that all of the Gospels, in terms of their writing at least, post-date the death of Jesus. But crucially, pretty much all scholars agree that this is based on a tradition that preceded them. These are guys who didn't just get up one morning and make up a story. There is some source that scholars refer to known as Q, the Q source. I don't know who wrote it and what it is, but it's a hypothetical theoretical source that was the basis of certainly for Mark and possibly some of the other gospel writers. Fantastic. And then Anne was asking about 4:30 or so, why does it say that Jesus was a rabbi? Was he?
Well, it's a little anachronistic well, let me put it to you like this. Many of you may have heard of the two famous Jewish sages, Hillel and Shammai. Hillel and Shammai were people often refer to them as Rabbi Hillel and Rabbi Shammai. Point that I would make is that the term rabbi is anachronistic, because the term rabbi does not actually enter the lexicon until after the destruction of the temple. See, when the temple is destroyed, you enter a period of history known as Rabbinic Judaism. And that's when, so what's important therefore to understand is that the references to Hillel and Shammai appear first in a work known as the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah is written in rabbinic times. So what the rabbis are doing is they are projecting an image of themselves back onto Hillel and Shammai. And all of a sudden, Hillel and Shammai, who are great sages, become rabbis like themselves. So because Jesus comes out of a Jewish world, and certainly he was a teacher, we read that he taught in synagogues, he too is constructed as Rabbi Jesus as well. So it's an anachronism.
Thank you for that clarification. Closer to the end of your presentation, Phyllis asks, I thought the Hebrews ate the manna and lived, not died. Why does John talk about them dying after eating the manna?
Well, I think this is what you see. What you have to understand is that the way the New Testament writers approach the Hebrew scriptures is that they do it in two ways. They either see Jesus's life as a fulfillment of what is being predicted in New Scriptures, but also they write in a polemical tone. You have to remember that when John is writing, in particular, in about the year of 100, what I refer to as the boxing gloves are off between Jews and the early Christian communities. Whilst they've been in a sort of a heated debate, Jews debating Jews, by the time you get to the period of John, it's very, very seriously like fighting each other in a certain sense. And in that sort of environment, the polemics becomes very strong. And rather than simply presenting the prophecy of the Hebrew scriptures as fulfillment, you actually go the next step and say, what the Hebrew scriptures talk about, we are doing one step better. Whereas the Hebrew scriptures say, in the story, manna is the bread of life, we have a new bread that replaces that bread of life, and it's the person of Jesus. And it's he who gives life. So it's sort of denigrating the old bread that the Jews sort of would have believed in, so to speak, and the new bread, the bread of Jesus. That's very much part of the polemical agenda that you find certainly in all of the New Testament books. But you've got to remember, it's in the context of a period where there's Judaism and early Christianity are growing apart from each other. And in the process of growing apart, there's a lot of name calling. And as good as early Christians are giving, Jews are giving just the same back. You have to understand that.
Thank you. The next question is, even if people, sounds like the apostles quoted Psalms, etc., and put these words in Jesus's mouth. Can you comment on that?
Well, all I will say, if that's what you want to believe, then all blessings on you. I'm not going to be the adjudicator here. I learned many years ago that taking a position in an audience, in certain audiences, you're asking for a lot of trouble. The point that I would simply make is that, yes, at the liberal end of Christian scholarship, there is this idea that what you have is the Johannine Jesus, the Matthean Jesus, the Lucan Jesus, each one of and the Markan Jesus, each one of them is constructing a figure of Jesus who fits the needs of their particular situation. So to that extent, they are, quote unquote, putting words in his mouth. But having said that, I think that we also have to understand it's not simply a matter of making words up. Again, I come back to the position, they were a group of people who had received a long-standing oral tradition about what Jesus said and did. And I have no doubt that there are certain things about Jesus that he may have said. They may not have quoted him directly. They may have spun that in a certain way to suit their message. So I think it's important, therefore, to understand that when we say, oh, they were just putting words into the mouth of Jesus, we should not just flippantly make that remark, but recognizing that at the very, very least, there's a very solid tradition that preceded what they wrote about Jesus.
Thank you. And then the next question is kind of a comment. Even if people were at the crucifixion, isn't it like two people seeing a car accident and having different accounts?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great way of illustrating it. And I think I remember when I studied New Testament material many decades ago at university, I did biblical studies. When we studied the Synoptic Gospels, we didn't bring in three separate documents. We actually studied them alongside each other, because that's what synoptic means. And the reason you did that is you wanted to sort of, as you say, two different versions of what you see at a car accident. And all of a sudden you're reading Mark and you say, oh, wait a minute. Or a good example is Matthew at the crucifixion or at the trial. Matthew is the only author who says his blood be on us and our children. None of the other, and you can only see that when you study them alongside each other. And that's why it's very important to appreciate that there are differences, but more importantly, why the differences are there.
Fantastic. And I think this is a great question or thought to end on. What about the resurrection? We need another session.
Wow, that is definitely not something I'm going to get into. But again, reflecting the point that I made earlier, if you will go to someone like Crossan, he will talk about this concept of history prophesized, right? In other words, it's not history, but it's prophecy historicized. In other words, it's turning, because he's saying it's going back to certain prophecies and turning them into history, whereas conservative scholars will say it's actually history prophesized. So it's a debate in much the same way as all of the issues that I've been talking about.
Well, I want to thank you, Paul, for another outstanding presentation. This whole series has been incredible. I'll echo so many comments from our participants via emails, through our evaluations, and in the chat. We are so very thankful for you sharing your scholarship with us. We hope that we can work with you again soon. We'll start brainstorming topics that we can bring to our audience. We hope that everyone will join us this Thursday at 3 p.m. We have our post-film discussion of Spear Goes to Hollywood, as well as a vast array of other programmatic offerings over the next week and months. As you know, we don't charge for our virtual programming, as it's our mission to reach as many people as possible. If you wish to make a contribution to support these programs, please visit our website to donate online. Stay safe, stay healthy. We hope we'll see you all again soon. I'll be sure to send all of this off. Yes. I will
say that if you are going to get me to do something in the future, if I've upset a lot of Christians in this session, I can do something in the future that will upset a lot of Jews. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander, I will say. Okay. All the best.
I think it's fantastic. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Again, people just commenting in the chat. Thanking you so much, Paul. We hope we'll see you all again soon. Again, you'll be sure to get the link to this recording as well as the entire series, the books that Paul mentioned. Stay safe, stay healthy. Enjoy the rest of this beautiful day. Bye, everyone.